Behold, it's Natalia. Let's go find some monkeys, shall we?
Would you say sex is like riding a bicycle?
Nothing gets me going like Christmas and wigs. Let's check out this show.
I remember the first creature I beheld. He was a squirrel. His name was Kevin.
I heard you need a DNA sample.
I want to find light and joy in things that bring us together and unite us. And I think science is something that can unite us. Ow. God damn.
There's a world out there, a world that needs to be beheld.
Behold, and welcome back to another episode of Survival of the Filthiest. I'm your host, biological anthropologist, comedian, weirdo, Natalia Reagan. And I created this show because what the fuck is happening in this country? I mean, folks, we have a war on science, healthcare, DEI, people of color, gays, bays, jetways, veterans, queers, engineers, the vax, paperbacks, teachers, creatures, and the queer community, especially the trans community, non-binary folks, and genderqueer communities. So what better way to resist than to talk to scientists, comedians, and educators who are creating some good trouble to move this country forward rather than 5,876 steps back. And here's a quick reminder to please like, subscribe, and comment if you enjoy the show or ask any questions. And if you really like the show, you can become a Patreon member. I suggested it's a lot of fun. And today we're going to be talking about the spectrum of biological sex, something that is not new, something that scientists have known that sex does not fit into neat binary categories for decades. But now with the rise of trans visibility, everyone claims to be a biologist. And unfortunately, many of them have a non-existent education in biology. And honestly, that's not their fault. Humans love to put things in boxes. This is where I'm going to go through my slides. Hold on one second. This is a work in progress, folks. We like to, if I want to piss people off on Twitter, you know what you do? And I'm going to dead name Twitter. I'm sorry, but all you got to say is sex and gender are not the same, and neither are binary, and the firestorm begins. But folks, sex is on a spectrum. But the thing is, people love to put ourselves in boxes, neat little categories that help us understand the world. I mean, we're like cats. Just don't open this box. We all know how that ends in 7. Not a good time. But we like to think in binaries, right versus wrong, Dems versus Republicans, which is now getting closer to right versus wrong, the gatekeeper and the keymaster, and male and female. But we know that it's not that simple, not at all. And just real quickly, I want to talk about the differences between sex and gender. Today, we're going to be talking about biological sex, but we're going to hedge into gender because humans are a cultural species, and gender is culturally defined and constructed, and it is how somebody identifies, and it is also a spectrum. And sex is often described as biological, and we're going to talk about different ways it has been described in the past. The 3G model, which includes looking at one's genitals, gonads, and genes. And I'm so excited to talk to Agustín about this. But yes, it's not binary. And in fact, experts say anywhere between 1 and 1.7% of the population aren't born. They are born outside the typical binary system. That is about 80 million people around the world. So to say that, it's just a few folks, first of all, it's a few folks. Why do you care? But second of all, it's not just a few folks. It is a lot. And there we go. And why does this matter? It matters because in 2025, we have 859 bills just in this year alone have been proposed, anti-trans bills, and 83 have already been passed. So this is something that needs to be taught in schools early on, and everybody needs to know this information. And the person we're going to be talking today has written a book that's going to equip you with the knowledge to basically combat any trolls that try to tell you, what are you talking about? Sex is definitely binary. And this is also ironic, coming in a time that in 2024, Grindr basically shut down during the RNC last year because a lot of folks were requesting relations with folks that might not fit in a typical heterosexual spectrum. And that's okay. No shame in that game. But this is a problem. And this is why I think we need to talk about what's going on and how we do not need to be living in fear rather than to educate ourselves. And also the White House also proposed that we need to define, there's only going to be sex, not sex and gender. We're just going to look at sex. And they define sex as what you are at conception. And a lot of biologists, that raised alarms because we know that for the first 6 weeks after conception, this little zygote is basically presenting as female. So does that mean all these male politicians are just trans men? Possibly, possibly. And just a reminder that culture plays a huge role in our species. And that is why when we hear these folks that are saying, where are all the masculine men at? You hear that cry across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, all these very conservative men yelling about masculine men, the ones that could wrestle a bear or perhaps even this bear and win. I'd say they're definitely winning. Personally, I say they're definitely winning. Or they'll say, why aren't we like our forefathers? And I think, did we have the same forefathers? Because let's look at George Washington on the $1 bill. Okay, first of all, look at those rosy cheeks, that freshly curled wig, and a low pony with a velveteen tie. That man in the background is definitely winding up to slap him on the keister. No shame in that game. Oh, wow. Is that a John Hancock in your pants? Or are you just happy to see me? Those are his tightly fitting pants, his capri pants. George Washington was really putting it on. And a man at his side to tend to all his needs. And speaking of needs, look at those knee-high boots. So again, what is considered masculine and feminine? Oh, yeah, they said that he had wood in his teeth. I think he just had wood in his teeth. That might be a little too much, going a little far, put it out there. But George Washington really does challenge this idea of present masculine looks, right? And I want to remind you that short kings are where high heels came from. High heels were made for short kings. So again, what is considered masculine and feminine has changed through the ages. And if you're going to have issues with trans or drag performers, you need to take it up with nature, because this right here was the original OG trans icon right here. This is the original drag king. This is a peacock, of course. So folks, I'm very excited to talk to the wonderful Agustín Fuentes, who has a new book out called Sex is a Spectrum, the biological limits of the binary, excuse me. And I want to say a couple things about the wonderful Agustín Fuentes, because he is somebody that I've looked up for years. I met him in 2010 at the AABAs, the biological anthropology meetings. He's an anthropologist who his research focuses on biosocial, delving into the entanglement of biological systems with the social and cultural lives of humans, our ancestors, and a few other animals with whom humanity shares close relations, from chasing monkeys in jungles and cities, to exploring the lives of our evolutionary ancestors, to examining human health, behavior, and diversity across the globe. Professor Fuentes is interested in both the big questions and the small details of what makes humans our close and our close relations tick. Earning his BA and BS in anthropology and zoology and his MA and PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley, he has conducted research across 4 continents, multiple species, and 2 million years of human history. And I just want to go through a couple of his books, and you need to buy them. He's written Why We Behave, Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You, The Creative Spark, and now Sex is a Spectrum, the biological limits of the binary. I got it. Please, people of the internet, welcome Dr. Agustín Fuentes of Princeton University. Welcome. How are you?
Hey, I'm great. That's a fantastic intro. I'm super excited to be here.
I am so excited to have you. The book is amazing. It is so necessary and of its time and so relevant right now. And just a quick question about your background. What made you want to become an anthropologist? I know you was a primatologist first, but you cover everything.
Yeah, one of the crazy things is that really before I even, was a freshman or even actually a sophomore in college, I didn't really know anthropology was a thing. And then I ended up taking a couple classes and realizing that there was something that can study people, can study our evolution, can study our biology, can study our health, can study different cultures across the planet, can study monkeys, can look at bones, can look at all this different kind of stuff. And I was like, wait a minute. I could do this, and here I am.
Here you are. Well, I mean, you've written so many books that have debunked myths about and misconceptions about human behavior and morphology. Why this book now? What made you want to talk about the biological limits of the binary?
Well, I mean, you already sort of said it in the beginning. Look, right now, the issue of sex, of gender, of how people navigate the world, how we live in the world is blowing up. It's hugely important. Everyone, every single human being is in a body, is in a culture, is in a life. And the conversations, particularly around sex and gender right now, are bad. They're just awful. There's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of misinformation. And I kept having these conversations trying, on social media, in classrooms, in public lectures, trying to be like, hey, check this out. This is complicated. It's really interesting. And people are like, ah, freaking out and like lobbing BS left and right nonstop. And I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, if we're going to have this conversation, if you really want to talk about sex, about bodies, about genitals, about genetics, about sexuality, if you really want to do that, you need to know what the heck you're talking about, right? You need to know what are bodies, what is sex, what is biology, what is the sets of biological processes in the body associated with sex, what is gender, and how do humans do all this, and how does everything else do this? So I wrote a book that basically takes us from the beginning, right? In the beginning. So chapter 1 starts, in the beginning, there was no sex, because there wasn't. Sex hadn't evolved yet. And walks the reader all the way through, like, what do we mean when we say sex about an evolutionary biological process? What do we mean when we talk about reproduction? What do we mean when we talk about how do different animals do sex? And finally, what do we know about us today?
Yeah, and I think it's really great that you do cover so many animals up front, which I think humans have a really easy time understanding that animals might not fit into the binary. That, like, for instance, all earthworms are, intersex, right? Earthworm Jim is a they them, right? Or
Right.
that the wrasse can switch sex back and forth. These things are something that we can understand. Why do you think that humans have such a hard time wrapping their head around or able to accept the fact that we don't fit into a binary?
Well, because two things, right? One, most people don't know what they mean when they say binary, right, or spectrum. And two, we all live in a culture. We all live in different things with histories. And one thing that humans try to do is, as you said, and I love the cat in the box, put us in boxes. All humans categorize stuff. And many contemporary societies based on particular histories, particular religious beliefs, particular capitalist structures, say, here are our boxes, 1, 2. Right. And we know that cross-culturally, many societies have multiple boxes, lots of different categories. So we can get into that. But let me start with this one thing, because this is what I want to give this sort of lecture in public. Look, what's a binary? People are like, binary, there's just two sexes. I'm like, wait a minute. A binary is a 1 and a 0, right? Those are both digits, right? They're both numbers, but they have nothing to do with one another, aside from the fact they're both numbers. They don't overlap. They don't cross. They are two different kinds of thing within a category, right? It's a category of numbers. There's a 1 and a 0. Okay. So if you want to say that in humans, mean Homo sapiens, our species, there's a, female and a male, you're wrong. That's not the way it works. What we have is a bunch of biological variation that's distributed in bodies. Everything, every single one of us has, is built of the same stuff. But what we have is different frequencies, different variants, right? Different patterns. And there are these typical patterns. And so we have two typical patterns that we're going to call 3G male and 3G female. That is an association between a particular kind of genes, particular kind of gonads, particular kind of genitals. And that has all these other correlations to biology. There are definite patterns. Male and female are not the same thing, but they're not different kinds of thing. They're different clusters of variation. And so that's the limit of the binary. Binary thinking makes us think they're just two kinds with nothing else, but we know there are two clusters of typical cluster variation and lots of stuff in between them. And if we're biologists, if we're doing biology, you can't be like, well, I just like this stuff. I'm just going to ignore variation, right? You can't ignore variation. Variation is what drives evolution. And so if you really want to have this discussion, you got to know what you're talking about.
And I like that we're using the word variation, because for years they were considered disorders or,
Right.
Anomalies or something, pathological, but this is variation.
Well, but I mean, even go beyond, don't even think about just folks that fall outside of the typical clusters of male and female. Think of the entire thing as variation, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, people don't recognize. So, for example, what is that overlap? How do bodies move back and forth? Okay, so all humans, right, develop fatty tissues in this area, right? And in fact, certain subsets of humans, right, clustering primarily into female, develops glandular tissue that facilitates lactation should pregnancy and other things happen. But 40 to 60% of those humans called male, right, develop fatty depositions around the nipples and in the chest area, which we would call what they call gynecomastia, which are just breasts, look, man boobs are a real thing and it's a normal thing. You can look around, that's just part of the development. Now there's differences in how breasts develop and the kinds of fatty deposition across different, clusters in human species, but all of us, right, are the same people. We're the same species. And so you have to think about how does that variation distributed itself? And that I'm rambling here, but it's just,
No, you're
I
not.
want people not to just think about like when we talk about variation, we're talking about some,
Outside.
1%.
Yeah.
Everyone is inside the species.
Yeah.
And if you're
I
really
love
talking
that.
about biology, we need to talk about what's inside the species.
No, that's perfect. And I think that's, again, to really drive home the point that, yeah, there is so much variation and just understanding that there's so much overlap too. I mean, and you
Yeah.
brought up, I mean, I just, excuse the expression, but I think of Bob's bitch tits from Fight Club. You know what I mean? Like, and all the hell, but we all have met people and know people. There's so much variation in our body shapes and sizes. I mean, the book you address things like, height and the overlapping, or even, and one of the things I want to talk to you about are just some of the key elements of biology that people use to break down this idea of a binary. And one is brain differences. Can you speak a little bit about, yes, yeah, right.
So, I mean, everyone's like male, female brains, right? Male brains, female brains. Okay, first off, those things don't exist, right? Anyone who argues that, it's usually a psychologist or a few neuroscientists do, but there's great literature out there. Lise Elliott and their colleagues published a study a couple years ago called Dump the Dimorphism, where they look at thousands of studies and, tens of thousands of brain scans and actual brains themselves. And the bottom line is, of all the variation in human brains, right? If you were just to line up all the brains of 8 billion people on the planet today, what sex you are, right? Whether you're classified male or female, depending on which categories, but let's say male and female, explains less than 1% of all the variation in brains. So that means that brains vary individually and by size, by a whole bunch of different kinds of stuff, but not male and female. That's not the way it works. Now, what's really interesting, it's like, so if I was holding a bunch of brains here, you couldn't tell what they were. On average, humans with bigger bodies have bigger brains. Duh, but that's because your brain is bigger. And there's a couple other little tweaks and patterns. But what's really interesting is that if you take a bunch of 7-year-olds, right, from across whatever range of gender spectrum you want, you don't find a particular pattern in their brain. But if you take a bunch of 25-year-olds, those that self-identify as women and those that self-identify as men, or feminine and masculine, you will find their brains react differently to stuff. So what happens is gender, the way we enculturate, the way we learn about the world, shapes the way our bodies and brains react to the world. And so, yeah, there's some important patterns that are fascinating and really cool, but it's not because our brains are different, it's because our lives are different. And that's what shapes how we work.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, because essentially we are a biocultural species. I mean, you bring that up all the time. Can you speak a little bit about that and how we can, recognize these things? You just brought up a great example.
I just so like biocultural, and this is the one thing that we can talk about other species, and I think there's some real complexities, but humans from before we are born, right, while we're developing in the womb, the behavior of our mother, the behavior of the people around her, the kind of context she's in, stresses and whatnot, the kind of food she has access to, the kind of social supports he has, actually affects the way we develop biologically and physiologically. Once we're out in the world, those things continue, right? Humans are biocultural. That means we're always a mixture. So for example, I tell this people all the time, I'm not going to pull my shoes off and show you my feet, but one thing that I find really fascinating
it's okay.
is
It's that time of show.
the thing is, like, everyone who's listening, like, think about that pinky toe. Right? I want you to think about your pinky toe. When you look down, you're like, what's up with the pinky toe? It's like all small. It's like curled in there. It's like, what is the pinky toe doing? Okay, so it turns out if you did not wear shoes your whole life, your feet are like this, right? Your toes
Splayed.
spread out. The pinky toe doesn't. So when you see your foot all like this and stuff, that is cultural. Your foot develops, the bones, the muscles, the ligaments develop in a particular cultural context. And so as an adult, your foot is a biocultural piece of material. Our skin is biocultural, right? You put on creams, put on lotions, or you don't, all right? And different kinds of things happen. Anyway, again, I'm rambling here, but this is such an exciting topic. Our bodies are biocultural. So when it comes to sex and the biology of sex, right? All the things associated with reproductive systems and other parts of the body that are connected to that. The cultural structuring and dynamic is a central part of who we are. So really, we can talk about gender and sex, right? And talk about biology and culture, but the two are never separate. They don't exist without one another.
Yeah. And another one of the elements that I really got me thinking, and I love that you covered, was hormones.
Yeah.
And that hormones,
Oh,
there's so much. I mean, like that right there, there's a whole other show. I had
yeah.
Sarah Lacey and Kara Achenbach on to talk about Woman the
Great.
Hunter and about how, hormones and how estrogen actually helps with endurance, right? And things of that sort. So persistence hunting, it would have been very helpful. And some athletes even take it because it helps them perform better. So, can you talk about like maybe the overlap of the hormones and that
So
there's not male, female?
there are no such thing as there's no male or female hormones, right? There's different frequencies that are typical in different bodies. Okay, so but think about it this way. So we have an endocrine system. That is, we have a bunch of glands and different organs that produce hormones in the body. All humans have the same system, right? Except most humans have either testes or ovaries as the gonad that they have. Now, some humans have ovotestes, some humans have both. So that let's just talk about ovaries and testes. What most people don't realize is that ovaries, which are associated with 3G females, right, a particular typical cluster of variation, and testes associated with 3G males, a particular cluster variation, those gonads produce testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, and some other stuff. But those are the big three. All humans have testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, and in fact, all humans need those. In fact, most animals need them, right? But what's really fascinating is that people are like, well, testosterone, T, right? That's what makes men. It's like, okay, on average, this cluster, this category of variation we're calling male, has higher circulating levels of testosterone and some differences in the body because of that. That doesn't mean women don't have testosterone. It doesn't mean they don't produce testosterone. And the flip side is true. It doesn't mean men don't have estrogen, and estrogen doesn't do critically important things. There's varying and fluctuating levels. There's some big differences, right, between typical clusters of variation in testosterone and estrogen, but there's not a binary. There's not a binary.
Oh, we got a question real quick. Oh, Jonathan Marks. You might have heard of him. Uh, Happy retirement, Dr. Jonathan Marks. Please tell us how you make a hormone.
Oh,
Okay, Seymour Butts. Dr. Jonathan Patron is a patron of the show and a member of my Patreon. So just a reminder, folks, if you're having a good time, feel free to join and ask us more questions like how do you make a hormone? Well, we've talked a little bit about 3G. I sort of acknowledged it up top, but just to really drive home the point, what is a 3G male and female?
So most people have these weird ideas about sex as this sort of essentialist thing. And so a lot of people I fight with, even some biologist colleagues, right, are like, no, sex is gametes. If you make an egg, you're a female. If you make a sperm, you're a male. Okay. Or if you have XX, you're a female. If you have XY, you're a male. Okay. Neither of those things are totally true. Not all individuals we're going to categorize as male can be lumped that easily. And if you're just going to say a woman, like gametes, right, sperm or egg, if you're going to say that's all you need to know about someone, a human or any mammal or any animal, you're wrong, right? Because there's not a one-to-one correlation between making an egg and every aspect of your body or every aspect of your behavior or your ecology. All right, so gametes, genetics, those are not the ways in which we can categorize males and females. So what are we really talking about? A lot of people, when they research this, talk about sex assignment at birth, which means, you come out, the doctor's like, penis or not. And you get a decision. That's a really bad, not very biological assessment. A lot of change happens in genitals as we develop, particularly towards puberty. So that's classically not the best assignment. So the real good assignment when you're talking about average or typical categories is 3G. And that is, there is a strong concordance of variation around individuals who cluster around a particular set of genetics, a particular set of genitals, and a particular set of gonads, right? So a male 3G has testes and penis, is XY, testes, penis and scrotum, and XY. A female 3G has vagina and labia, clitoris, ovaries, and is XX. Now, why I use 3G categories is they are not essentialist. It's not like there's just one way to be. They are varied in the 3Gs themselves, and there are individuals that don't fit into 3G categories. There are many individual humans, you even pointed this out, at least 80 million, if not more, that don't neatly fit. There's in fact probably a lot more, and most of the folks who do that don't know it because there's huge variation in bodies. So anyways, that was just a ridiculously long ramble, but I hope it made some sense.
It was great. No, everything, this is, again, I really do wish, and I want people to watch this, and I want this to be a source for people can come to and become equipped with the knowledge to go out and talk to others, because I really do think that, people that are probably going to watch this, let's be real, are people that are probably already a little in the know, or they're angry and watching. But there are those people that might not have the information to back it up. And there's, the idea of an ideal informant. People are more apt to believe someone who's like you, right? We talked about it last week on the show with data science, Andrea Jones-Roy. And, if you're an ally and you want to go out, it shouldn't be our trans brothers and sisters and anyone in between that are having to do all the work. So I really, this is wonderful. That's all to say. Thank you.
Yeah. And this is all, it's about everyone. And that's what I keep trying to, like, people are like, oh, it's about one. This is about all of us. And this is what I ask people to do when I sort of talk about this in a big auditorium or something with a ton of people. I'm like, okay, how do you feel about your own body? Don't share, just introspect. How do you feel about your own body? And how do you think about your body in comparison to other bodies? Variation. There's differences. There's patterns. Every single person, I'm sure, in every audience that I speak to knows folks who don't fit cleanly into the sort of categories we have of male or female, or the genders of men and women. There's lots of variation there, and individuals themselves may feel that they have some weird variant on that. And so part of this is to get people to recognize, dude, that's totally cool. That's the way we are. There's a lot of variation. There is not one way. It's not having genitals. Oh my God. If you porn is not a good example of what genitals look like in humanity, right? There's a selection. Not? There's folk. The bottom line is, if you were actually to look at 1 million genitals, you would see massive variation. There's a huge range in fully functioning genitalia in humans. And we have this fixation of particular kinds and particular patterns. And the same is true for every other aspect of our body. Variation is central. Now, before people get all pissed off and the people who are hate watching start yelling, that doesn't mean that this cluster of variation that is male and this cluster of variation that is female are the same thing. They are not. They're different clusters of variation, but they don't explain all the variation in humans, and they're not two different kinds of thing. That's my punchline, right? So it's not like people aren't different. It's not like there aren't some really important patterns. It's not like everyone can, get pregnant and give birth. They can't, or lactate. They can't. There's patterns, or menstruate, right? There are patterns that are really important, but it's not a different kind of creature, of being. It's all about variation in humanity.
Absolutely. And I feel like there, those that claim that by acknowledging trans women, we're taking away from, 3G women, which I think is ridiculous, because a example I like to point out is Dr. Blair Peters, the, gender affirming care surgeon, who actually finally counted all the nerve fibers. I mean, not by themselves. I think they had help on the clitoris, because, and I asked them why, it was to build a better penis. So it was actually for trans healthcare. And it's like everybody benefited in that situation. But you do talk a little bit about biological sex, and also, in the medical world. Can you talk a little bit about why maybe that's important, but it's also important to acknowledge the variation?
Right. Yeah. No, and I think this is really, really important. But I'm actually gonna push on one thing. I actually don't say biological sex. I say sex biology, because biological, if we're talking about sex and we're talking about biological parameters, then the word biological in front of sex does nothing. And people use it just to say there's one way. I'm like, no, there's sex biology. So there's biology, there's bodies, and there's patterns of variation associated with sex, right? And that's how we know. So anyways.
I'm taking a note.
I know it's uptight, but I'm just like, dude, because it's important. So health, right? So what's really, really important, and I think let's just talk about the US in general, since we're here right now talking about it. There's a history of excluding women, right? This broad gender category, which includes a huge range of bodies, right? That are primarily 3G female, but also male, and a bunch of, anyway. There's a huge history of exclusion of women from medical investigation and study. And that's well known and well documented. So a lot of people are like, well, but then you have to include women in studies. Yes, absolutely. But the problem of just doing that, right? You must do that. But of just doing that is then most medical research is like, okay, we have a population of 100 individuals. All right, well, we have two kinds. We have the females and the males. So let's study them as if they're different. And lo and behold, we miss a lot of stuff that's actually not dependent on biological variation associated with sex. That's actually dependent on other things, but because we start immediately. So for example, if you were to study, let's say, psychological disorders with the intent of finding the part of the brain that is associated with them, if you divide your study population first into male and female before you ask the questions, you're going to see some patterns that don't exist because you've artificially divided brains into clusters that do not represent brain biology. Does that make sense? And I mean, this is the same thing as too with pharmaceuticals and
absolutely.
there's that great research out of the Gender Sci Lab on Zolpidem, right? The Ambien, the drug where, first of all, they did all this sort of tests on men, and then there was having some issues with it with women. So they're like, well, we're just going to cut the dose by half because women are smaller than men. But that then ended up not really working well in women. That is, the Ambien was not doing what it was supposed to do. And it turns out that Ambien is not related necessarily to sex. It's probably related to some uptake and some issues on the receptors that are associated with testosterone, but not necessarily associated with just high levels of testosterone. And so, in fact, a really good study of what's going on with many drugs shows it's not just about body size, or it's not just about sort of hormone differences. There might be actually some pattern differences in humans that don't necessarily map to sex that are what's going on. And if you always divide up male and female to start with, you're going to miss all of the possible discoveries. One more example, right? We know that men are on average taller than women, right? On average, but there's about a 78% overlap. So if you actually use height to I'm just going to use height to identify people in the United States, you're going to be wrong 7 out of 10 times.
I love it. No, but it's true. There's so much variation across the globe when it comes to things like morphological differences. Absolutely. And we forget that, like I remember what was that movie Twins years ago with Danny DeVito and just again, we live in a world where you had like Andre the Giant and then you have somebody who might be 2.5 feet tall. So, and if aliens came down to Earth and again, with like Women the Hunter, if somebody's digging up graves and you do use an example of a pelvis that was found that, was later re-examined and believed to be male at first, and then was believed to be female. And these things happen. It's hard to.
We do this all the time. Like there's a whole like industry of like people reassessing skeletons, famous Vikings, and whatever was buried with a sword must be a guy. No, it's not a guy, probably, or at least the bones don't tell us. So I think this is, but here's the problem, right? You talked about this early on. People have contemporary lenses of gender. We believe the world is a certain way. We believe men and women are certain ways. And we look into the past and we see that same stuff. And it turns out the past is really confusing, and we can't actually see gender very well. We can see bones, we can see materials, but we don't really know what's going on. And what's fascinating is that when you look in the past and try to reconstruct gender, especially the deep past, you see gender that looks like we're what we see today in the last 4, 6, 7,000 years. But you go back 20, 30, 40, 100,000 years, 200,000 years, and you're not seeing the same patterns. Doesn't mean gender wasn't there. Just means it's clearly not identical to what it is today.
God, it's fascinating. I mean, and just even like just the assumptions about division of labor, what that would have looked like, and understand, we really do foist these very Western ideas that are often, only a few hundred years old in some cases, onto groups of people that lived, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years ago, or even 30,000 years ago.
Yeah, so, the division of labor is there, right? We see probably that's a good way, like human ancestors are pretty smart. They figured we're here, right? So they figured some way out to make it. And, they were, didn't have big teeth or fangs or horns. They just, were sort of naked and a little bit of hair and not much, some rocks and sticks, but they had each other. So they figured stuff out. But what's really cool about that is that when we look at these patterns and we look at bodies and things like that, we see that a lot of these bodies don't fit the patterns we see today. So, for example, in a lot of populations today, we see divisions of labor, strongly between what we're calling men and women, right? That could also be in the past, but some of the divisions of labor today are based on upper body strength and bone density and things like that. So if you go back 30, 40, 50, 60,000 years, you're going to find everyone, right, whether we're categorizing them 3G male or 3G female, has actually higher muscle density, larger, more robust muscles, actually was stronger than any, would sort of kick all of our asses. And in that context, no, but think about that, because the explanation in the past, and you had Kara Achenbach and Sarah Lacey on here to sort of talk about this. The assumption was, well, looking at certain contemporary, mostly societies today, we extrapolate that to the past. But people in the past were a little different, and so they did things differently. I'm not saying men and women, or whatever categories they had, were the same. I'm saying that what we know is that bodies and patterns and lives were clearly different in the past. And up until recently, as you just said, the distribution of gender patterns and norms used to be really different. It's really the last few centuries that a very, very limited set of gender reality and experience has been imposed on the world.
Yeah, yeah, and I just feel like when we talked about women the hunter and just the division of labor in groups that small in the early days, so like middle Pleistocene, late Pleistocene, we
Yeah.
probably were not. Everybody was doing the same damn thing. So I mean, if you
Yep.
think about it, the past was very progressive. I mean, even looking at third genders across the
Yeah.
world, right? We had a lot of
Yeah.
third genders and gender pluralities, and
Yeah.
it's not new. I think that it's interesting, this idea that all of this, talking about sex biology as not being a binary is like brand spanking new. But I mean, you do address this in your book, the fascinating idea that up until not that long ago, there were not divisions between the sexes. It was just, the same species and a
Well,
hierarchy. Like,
yeah, I mean, there's some kinds of relations, but let's think about this. Like the one thing people go to is like, well, of course, look, women, we can get to the debate about, but like people with uteruses, right,
mhm.
can gestate and lactate and give birth, right? Okay, so clearly having a uterus and a capacity to lactate puts you front and center in reproduction, right? So you produce like the infant, you birth the infant. In many mammals, right, females take, like the individual with the uterus and the mammary glands who births the infants takes, control and does most of the work. In some mammals, the female hands that infant off to someone else to do a bunch of the work.
Yeah.
But humans actually figured something out weird, because we got these big gigantic brains now, and we have this really weird developmental thing where the human is born and it takes them years to walk, whereas a giraffe is born in like 15 minutes. It's like running across the savannah. But humans had to have something in place to be able to produce infants that are just useless, right? I mean, they have to be
Yeah.
cared for intensively.
Ugh.
And so what our ancestors did was they got together, they contributed. Everyone, regardless of your genitals or whether you have a uterus or not. Clearly, having uterus and the capacity to lactate was central, but all the energy, all the pressure of reproduction, of caretaking was distributed throughout the group. And we have very, very good evidence in human bodies today that all humans have the capacity to respond physiologically, right, hormonally, to caretaking. And so what's really cool is that when we talk about reproduction, we're like, well, women reproduce and men are off here hunting or whatever, or hanging out and playing cards and drinking. That's not true. Humans never would have made it if that was the case. What we have is a really interesting sort of cooperative biocultural reproductive system. And understanding that pushes against this basic idea of like, well, there's one natural way to be a family, or there's one way to sort of have kids and raise them. We know that's not true. There are many ways, many, many successful ways, and human families are amazing.
Oh, I love the variation of the modern family too. I mean, my
Yeah.
goodness. And I know that I mean, even legally, there's a lot of work being done to ensure their rights, because in a time during this administration, you got to ensure that, both, no matter how you do your family, whether it's two dads, two moms, or if there's three of you, I don't know, whatever, but like the village raises a family is such a beautiful phenomenon. And I remember watching a howler monkey give birth, like one does in Costa Rica, while TAing primate field school for Katie McKinnon. Shout out to you, my love. But yeah, I watched this howler monkey just kind of pull out the baby, sit there for like, I don't know, an hour, probably eat the placenta or lick it or whatever,
Right.
and then like go about her day. But
Yeah.
we're so altricial, like
Yeah.
useless, like gelatinous
Yeah.
sacks of beans and sand. That's what human babies are like. And they face the other way. So you need help. It's a whole thing. It's a
Yeah.
production. working in the film industry, it's like, like it's a production and everybody's got to chip in. And so, yes,
Right.
I sometimes joke, half joke in my classes that like agriculture ruined everything, or just putting down roots, just all of a sudden having strict divisions of labor. Men did the outside work, women did more of the, caretaking and things of that sort. Uh, I mean, do you think that really, obviously that was 12,000, Neolithic revolution,
Right.
11,000, 12,000 years ago. How do you think that has influenced?
Well, I mean, generally, you're right. Like, so that sets up new ways to be human, right? So, really,
Yeah.
in the last 10,000 years, we've set up a whole bunch of new ways, many of them restrictions, other than facilitations, right? Technology has expanded a lot, which allows us to do so. But what happens, I think, is really important is not all humans became agricultural or sedentary, which is actually really cool
Hmm.
because we always forget that tons and tons of humans are like, no, we're going to be over here. And but a lot of those societies that did become sort of agricultural and sedentary did develop sort of more extreme gender differences or different sort of social roles, different hierarchies, surplus of goods, but some didn't. And that's the thing you never get taught. They're like, oh, this is the way, because everyone looks at like, five different famous Middle Eastern societies of 5 to 7,000 years ago. Across the entire planet, humans did this stuff, settling down or not settling down, growing plants or not growing plants, domesticating animals, dividing up gender roles or not, dividing up hierarchies, making surplus, developing money, tons and tons of different ways. There's so many successful ways to be human. And what happened is we've like limited it. I mean, in some ways, and I'll get a little political, this is like the current administration trying to say there's no history, just this history. That's sort of already happened in a lot of the education. And people are like,
Yeah.
no, there's all this stuff in the past, but we're just going to talk about these three famous examples or these kinds of contexts. And I think scientifically, that's a problem because when we reduce our understanding of the actual variation in human history and in human bodies, we reduce the ability to understand why we are the way we are and how we are the way we are.
Oh God, absolutely. I don't know, just what you were saying reminded me of, the whole Sarah Hardy and the many fathers hypothesis of sort of concealed ovulation, that this idea that, human women are unique, and the fact that you don't know if we're ovulating. Well, maybe you do. Maybe, yeah, maybe you do a little bit if you know your person, your uterus having person well enough.
Right.
But there's this one theory, and I can't remember exactly who was the one that was saying this, but it would promote monogamy because you would want
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
lock down your female and make sure she's not stooping anybody else, and you had, those are my kids. But there was the Sarah Hardy. I think that, well, the more feminist critique, but the more
Right.
I think logical, because like you said, humans have so many different ways of doing sex, doing life, doing
Right.
reproduction. Not everybody's monogamous, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't
No,
always.
no,
No.
not at all.
Yeah.
But no, but we can be, many people are very socially monogamous and might not be sexually monogamous. I mean, there's a whole bunch of range. It's funny
Monogamish.
that you bring it up. Yeah, yeah, monogamish.
Yeah.
No, but you bring this up. I think that's really because there's a bunch of dudes, usually older dudes, not always, who are like, oh, monogamy evolved in this kind of way. Males provision females and females reproduce and this. And it's like when you actually look at the data, that's not even true in monogamous societies. There's much more complexity. There's a lot of things going on. The bottom line is that humans are very dynamic when it comes to creating families, to raising children, to living in social groups. And again, I just want to be very, very clear. I am not saying there's no differences. I'm not saying the gender roles of men and women are the same. I'm not saying males and females are the same. I'm saying, what is the variation out there? How do we understand this? And I would say a spectrum that is a range of stuff with typical clusters is a much better way to understand our bodies, our histories, and our contemporary lives than the notion of a binary. The binary is wrong, and it just gets us in these bad places where like there's only one way to be X, right? Or one way to
Yeah.
be Y. And that's just not true, right? Even, I think the binary even just harms people who totally commit to it because then they are like, oh, my body doesn't quite fit. Like, no, you're
Yeah.
just part of the variation of being human.
Oh, I think, and that's so much more beautiful and so much more interesting. How boring is a binary? And I mean, honestly,
Yeah.
like, uh, I feel like the world is so much more beautiful, magical, interesting than what we give it credit for. That science, I think, is always constantly, good science changes as you
Yeah.
gather more data. We
Yeah.
find more stuff out, and I think that's also a huge problem uh, with how science might be being taught in elementary school,
Right.
that I'd say that science is more of a verb. It's a process. It's not a
Yeah.
noun. It's
Yep.
always changing. And unfortunately, I think that was a big problem with COVID, because by the
Yeah.
time a pandemic rolls around and they're getting new information, it's like it's blowing their noodle, because they think that science is like religion and it's static. But just understanding that as we're gathering more data, and I think that's so much more interesting to understand that the world doesn't fit into neat little categories. But
Yeah.
I think, I mean, do you think that, I mean, this is getting kind of into the psychology of it, of why humans might be adverse to, I mean, like you already mentioned that they might not understand the binary, but even if they do you think that there's pushback because of fear, because of maybe it's a
Yeah.
mirror to themselves and they don't want to be that? I mean, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, but I mean, this is also, I mean, we have to think about the political moment that we're in right now, right? So, where you're seeing a lot of this violence against variation and different senses of identity emerging, or different ways that were much more common in other societies, or in past societies, even the same society that we're in right now. What we're seeing is a kind of creation that centers around, I think, control, ways of controlling. So, a binary gender typicality, binary notions of sex are really not about biology. They're not about science. They're about political and maybe economic control, right? Because if you have these categories and there's no variation in them, then you get to say things, you get to make laws, you get to do kinds of things that limit, right? So if you look at all, you pointed at 895 laws, anti-trans, LGBTQ sort of laws in the United States, right? Or, well, bills that are being forwarded, but a bunch of them are becoming laws. None of those None of those are for expanding rights. All of those
Yeah.
laws, based on the binary, are for reducing rights. And my question is, and you asked this earlier, when you reduce sort of people's rights to be themselves in a different kind of context, well, what does that do? It's one thing if someone's sort of self is running around trying to hit people on the head with a hammer, right? If being someone's self is just navigating the incredibly complex biocultural reality of what human identity is like, what human sexuality is like, and what human bodies are like, if you want to constrain that and say that there's only two ways to be effectively human, you're just lying, and you're doing it on purpose because you want to control people.
Oh God. Thank you. That was so perfect. And agreed. I think control is, whether it's, women's reproductive rights, whether it's trans community, LGBTQIA. I mean, it is about, you know, people of color. It's about control. And I do feel like sometimes it's like, I don't want to say last dying gasp, because I feel like I don't want to jinx it, but I feel like it's a
One
gasp
can hope.
of the
Yeah,
patriarchy, the white supremacy.
yeah.
We won't wade into race, because that's a whole nother episode, which you also cover so beautifully. But we're wading into a time where the white people are no longer going to be a majority, and that, you would think they would be a little bit nicer to the people who are going to be possibly the majority. But yeah, I mean, it's almost like a last dying gasp of the patriarchy
Well,
to,
well, because there's a couple centuries of particular kinds of control that are getting harder and harder to manifest, and that's why we're seeing a move towards authoritarian structures and things like that. Where, and that's a much larger conversation. But I think you're right, right? There's the world is changing, and people who don't want to see change happen are freaking out. There's a great question:
yes. Yeah.
is as opposed to Claude Levi-Strauss, a famous anthropologist, who argued that binary thought, right, is fundamental, that humans are always dualists, right? This is the way we think of the world. I actually don't think that's totally true. I think contemporary Western tradition has been heavily influenced by a particular philosophical and theological set of frames, so that we, right, let's talk about the United States, but really the sort of general Western world and sort of growing world, because of the economic and political influence, has this notion of right or wrong, black or white. But what's really interesting is that scientists shouldn't have that. Biologists, like people talking about when you're talking about biology, if you're like it's yes or no, always black or white, it's one state or the other, like almost nothing in biology occurs in that way. And so to think that binary is just a way our brains work, I suggest that's probably not true, because there's pretty good evidence that there's very, very strong cultural and sort of historical framings around binaries. Some societies do it in different ways. I think one thing that does, and that Levi Strauss was sort of right about, is that it is actually easy. Humans love to categorize, and there's a fixed number of categories that we want to work with. And two categories is a really good number, although three is also a very good number as well. So
yeah. And thank you. That was a question by Dr. Jonathan Marks, again, retiring. Congratulations, good sir.
And
And
everyone
you
should
should
read
read
his books.
read his books. Read his books, please. Read all his books. They are amazing. Tales of X-Apes. I'm just going to shout one out. Why I'm not a scientist. Is science racist? In short, yes, it is. Okay. Moving on. No, but again, we were talking about just the visibility and trying to control people. I recently, I did a show about Beyond the Binary, women in genderqueer history, and every year the Gallup poll comes back with higher numbers of folks now identifying in the LGBTQIA community. I think Gen Z
Right.
at this point is up to 20%. And one could argue, is the gay agenda working? And it's like, well, yeah, if it means you're being yourself, right? Like if
So-
because of visibility, representation,
Right. I mean, so one of the things is a whole bunch of other things have also radically increased in the last 50 years or 20 years, right?
Yeah.
A whole bunch of different things because we now know more about them, right?
Yes.
And in fact, there are many societies that had different ways of thinking of gender and identity. We have had, let's take the US, because that's where that number comes from, a very, very specific, particularly over the last century and a half, a very restrictive, increasingly restrictive notion of gender norms and gender behaviors. Now, right, over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, there's been some flexing in that area. So of course, people who are like, I don't feel like a binary. I sort of feel like this, but I'm not quite there. I sort of feel somewhere in here. And now there's an opportunity for someone to say, you know what, I feel here. What I love about a lot of this sort of what people call identity and sex, I mean, whatever, it's just people being themselves. Is they're exploring and figuring out. It's like, you know what, I feel this way, so I align sort of here, but not totally. Cool. I'm not even worried about what you call that. Like, be yourself, right? And that is beautiful. And that's what I love about a lot of the current sort of younger generations is they're like, nope, I'm this way. The problem is we live in a society where everyone's trying to put them in a box, right? It's like the cat's in a box, right? They're trying to do that nonstop. And I'm like, stop with the box. Why don't we do the science? Step back. And if we undo binary categories and say, we don't, you represent in these patterns as you feel fit, as you see fit. And then we actually study how people show up. That's much better science. That's going to tell us what's going on rather than saying you must be this or this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a miracle. I feel like those studies where they try to see what kids gravitate towards, like, it's like, you better nab them when they're 2 days old because otherwise, like it's
we
forced down
get
their
shaped,
throat.
right? So,
Yes.
I mean, in every single way, you could take two identical twins, separate them, reverse. Don't. I mean, that's a horrible thing to do.
No,
But if you
yeah,
did, right, and you
Wouldn't
raised
pass
one,
IRB.
yeah. If you raised one, up around, the North Pole. Just by the way, if you or any of your fans are really interested in good TV, the TV show North of North is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend it.
Really?
Anyway,
Okay,
North of
noted.
North, it's super awesome. Anyway, so if you raise someone, very far near the North Pole and someone else, let's say around the equator, let's say around somewhere in Brazil, and then you brought those twins together, same DNA, right? Brought those twins together as adults and gave them some fish to eat or salmon, or let them see a picture, or let them describe weather. They would do that differently, right? Even with the same genetics. They would do that because we're biocultural creatures and where we grow up shifts and changes us. And so acknowledging that is good science. And then recognizing that that helps us understand why people feel the way they do about categories, whether they fit or don't fit. And that's the thing, like tons of people are like, fine, this typical cluster, that's me. I am so good here. This is what makes me feel good. I'm fine. That's great. But why would that make you then be angry that someone doesn't fit into that category? That's the weird thing. Everyone should understand that variation, that's part of being human.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that because I feel like so many people that would acknowledge that they fit somewhere in between, or at least maybe not, they'd argue that I'm not all men, or I'm not like that, but they are so quick to lump other people in. I grew up, I only wore my boy cousin's hand-me-downs. My mom got called into a parent-teacher conference in kindergarten. She was afraid I did something terrible. And what they said to her was, Natalia only plays with boys. Which is funny now, but at the time, and thank goodness my mom just went, so like,
Yeah.
I was a tomboy, but like,
Right.
really was upset that I didn't wear dresses, that
Right.
I didn't fit into a, but it's just, and the joke was, their names were John, Jeffrey, Joseph, and Natalia, like I think my mom was more upset about the missed opportunity for alliteration. Right.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, even as children, and I think I've heard people even having babies, and I feel like a friend's sibling did this, and I need to look it up, where they had a child, but they didn't tell anybody their sex biology.
Right.
So they just raised it sort of gender neutral. And I should probably follow up and see how that went, because I think that's interesting, that
Probably not well. I mean, in the sense that you
yeah,
can't, it doesn't work that way because we are a gendered species, right?
yeah,
So even if you tried to keep kids from gendering, they would. And this is not to say that there aren't patterns of biology associated with hormones, associated with testes and ovaries, associated with particular muscle and skeletal development that create these typical clusters and trajectories. So it's not to say that those things don't occur. It's just that those things aren't a binary. Those things aren't two
yeah,
different kinds of things, right? And I think that's really interesting, right? Because you see pretty big differences during and post puberty that you don't see in a lot of biological characteristics pre puberty, right?
true.
That's
Yeah,
interesting, right? That's
yeah.
interesting, and that's really important. But you have to understand that as a biological pattern of variation, not that like all of a sudden testosterone shows up and makes a boy a man, right? That's not the way it
Right.
works.
No, yeah, it's not the bar mitzvah for the body, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but I think of, oh dear, where did the thought go? I love when the thought comes and then it goes. Where did you go? Oh, I might have to pivot. You say so many, I was talking about this last week. I don't want AI to be this good,
Right.
but I kind of do. I want my brain to take notes so I can have them up here.
Right.
Because while you were talking, I was like, oh my goodness. No, brains, body, it'll come 5 days from now while I'm sleeping.
But brains and
Um,
bodies, I mean, like, just the whole way in which we develop, right? And just back to where
oh,
we
yeah.
started. Yes, go ahead. Go, go,
Oh,
go, go.
okay. Well, no, just the idea that, what we're born with, and I know people that this has happened to, that you could be born seemingly in your mind, because you don't know, you think you're a 3G male,
Right.
female, but then puberty hits
Right. Whoop.
and you go to your first
Hey.
OBGY, yeah,
Yeah.
or you don't get a period because guess what? You were born without a uterus. And
Right.
you didn't
Right.
know this because
Right.
we don't do scans of
And
babies when they're, you know what I mean?
right. And we've got to get away from talking about even like the variation of the sex chromosomes. We've got to get away from disorders, right? I mean, there's some things that have developmental problems that cause, these patterns and make life very difficult for individuals, but the majority of these things don't. Right. And so we need to talk about variation. And I think this is important from the health perspective, but it's really important because once you understand what you just said, right, that, hey, there's some variation that you could go your whole life without knowing that you weren't a typical male or a typical female. And if that's true, then what are people getting so uptight about?
Yeah. And speaking of uptight people, I love the fact that like women's organized sports in the scheme of things, in the geological time, are very new, and
Yes.
still rarely watched. Let's be real. But boy, do
Yeah.
people have opinions about, trans athletes
Yeah.
or those that are 3G athletes that might not look like it, and can we talk a little bit about why they're
Yeah.
being
So
scrutinized? Yeah.
let's get into because there's the biology of intersex athletes, and then there's biology and discussion and patterns around and the politics around trans athletes. But before we do that, I think what's so important to point out is that, look, if all these people who are screaming about it, if they're really interested in supporting women in sports, then fund women's sports equitably as they do men's sports. Start from very young, make sure all the programs are equitable, make sure you get the same kind of training, make use of the same kind of funding. Then after, like, once you're fighting for that, then you want to talk to me about this other stuff, great. But
Yes.
until you actually support women, I don't want to hear. Okay. The other issue, and this is really long and complicated, and it is complicated, but the first thing is the contemporary debates about intersex individuals and both the Olympic Committee and the World Athletics, the big World Track and Field thing, making an assessment based on testosterone levels is highly problematic. Very, very good research demonstrates that testosterone doesn't have a major effect on the vast majority of sporting events. Now, body size, muscle density, and a couple other things, femur length, right? These things can, depending on which sport you're talking about, can have some impacts. However, right, you cannot identify single black and white or binary biological patterns that do that. So, for example, a slight higher than most women have testosterone level, right, might give you a slight benefit. But again, a longer femur than most women have might also give you a very good benefit. So you have to think about these things. And I'm not saying there's an easy, I'm just saying there's no one rule fits all for either trans or intersex context, that you have to really consider what is the sport, what's the variation you're talking about, and really, what's the big deal? There are over 500,000 NCAA athletes in the United States and about 14 trans women participating at a high level in that cluster. If you were going to spend millions of dollars and all of your political and economic clout to attack a very small and very, very threatened minority of individuals, just shame on you, man.
Yeah, and I think it's just a big distraction. I mean, honestly, I feel like it's, even though it's doing great harm, I feel like they're distracting from some of the bigger picture items and really tapping into the fears of a group of people that need to read your book, to quite honestly, right? I do want to one quick shout out. Hold on, My Unfinished Journey. Thank you so much for all your support. Hail Natalia and Dr. Fuentes, and hail Sexual Variation. Yes. We also have a question from Dalton Puckett. Is the premise not based on a conflation of variables, unless I'm misunderstanding? It's true that gender roles, height, and psychology aren't binary, but they don't influence the distribution of sex.
Well, it depends on how you're defining sex, right? What is the definition of sex here? I'm using the 3G definition because that's an actually biologically measurable definition. I'm not using definition of gametes because it doesn't really tell you anything. Like if someone produces, if you say all that matters about a definition is an egg, whether you produce egg or sperm, that really doesn't tell you enough to do good science. I use the 3G gametes, gonads, and genes because those are typical clusters. And so my point here is that actually those are distributed on a spectrum. Those are not distributed in a binary fashion, right? If you look at gonads come in two typical patterns, ovaries and testes. We have ovotestes. You also have different differential distribution of the tissues within ovaries or testes to overlap with one another, produce some of the same hormones or not. So you just don't have a binary. And that's my point. Not that they're the same. Not that sex is the same. Not that there aren't males and females, but that males and females are clusters of typical variation, not essential binary realities.
God, you speak in the most beautiful sound bites. No, I no, it was perfect. Everything, because honestly, and this is a big question for you. How do we move forward? I wish everybody got this education in elementary school. How do we get it out there? How what are your suggestions?
You hit the nail on the head. One thing, teach biology better, teach anthropology, like talk about human variation early on in education systems, right? Everyone should know, sex ed, where they're trying to get rid of all the time. Don't make it sex ed. In basic class, talk about reproduction, right? Reproductive biology is really interesting. You don't even have to talk about humans. You can talk about turtles, turtle reproduction. So turtle sex is determined by the temperature of the sand in which the eggs are laid, not the genetics. That's fascinating. There's a whole species or cluster of whiptail fence lizards, right, where there are no males, only females, and they've figured it out. Anyway, the bottom line is biology is just awesome. It's complicated, it's wondrous, amazing, and magical. And teaching biology early on, giving folks understanding of what biological patterns are, what typical patterns are, right? That when you say male or female, know what you're talking about. You're not talking about an egg or a sperm. You're talking about a cluster variation that has particular patterns and contexts and behaviors and physiologies. And if we just started early on talking about biology and anthropology, or at least talking about society, like don't lie to kids. Tell them things are complicated. Stuff is messed up. Here's a little bit of history. Those two things would get us really, really far.
God, yeah, complication, nuance is a tough one too. Sometimes with the internet, people have a hard time. Yeah, and the whiptail lizards, man. They don't need no man because they don't have one. Fascinating. And that's why I think it's so funny that humans will gladly accept that. But it's hard sometimes to accept that our own species could have such cool variation. I have to ask you, because I ask everybody, what is the filthiest thing you've done in the name of science?
A couple things, but
you're
one
a
very clear
primatologist,
is
so.
carry about 35 pounds of monkey shit internationally in a suitcase with me on the plane.
What species, sir?
A couple different species, actually. And this was
Wow.
well
Ooh.
before when you could do this. You cannot do this anymore. This was like 30 something years ago. So
Oh my
this was
God.
this was like, no, I really, because I was like doing samples, collected a bunch of pieces, and I had the permits, just take it on the plane with you, put it in the overhead. Yeah, it was like, I mean,
That's
it's
so
dried and
cool.
whatever, so in tubes, but that was, those days are gone, and they should be. I should not have been carrying a suitcase full of monkey shit on an airplane.
I mean, who amongst us hasn't, right?
Yeah,
You know?
sure.
No, but I mean, this is the thing. Primatologists have a really shitty job, quite literally in so many ways. But that means we did our job well because we got our samples.
Right. Yep.
No, and I think what you said about education, this is why it's so frustrating. I make a lot of videos about animal reproduction, and they
Right.
oftentimes get shadow banned, taken
Right.
down. Community guy, I got community guideline violated for having a naked bonobo in one of my videos, and it's just like the. And
There
again,
are
it's
nothing but naked bonobos.
Augustine, they should be wearing pants. Oh my God. Yeah, it's ridiculous. But no, I really
Yeah.
do wish that people had a better idea and hopefully, again, yeah, making it as normalized as possible. I know that I do a lot of stuff with the clit. Yeah. And people are
But
like,
I
why are
mean,
you bringing up the
kids, but
clitoris? They should know about it.
yeah, I think a lot of people should know about it. I think
Yeah.
that's, and most people don't actually. Most people don't, and most people don't have any idea of, the fact that the clitoris and the penis develop from the same tubercle, right? This is the same stuff going. Anyway, that's why you can study the nerve endings in the clitoris and learn a lot about the penis. Same vascular system as well. So anyway, the thing, and just to drive this home again, if you taught this stuff to 7, 8, 9, and 10-year-olds, which people freak out about, they would learn biology, they'd be more secure about their own bodies and their own lives, and they'd pay attention. Like if you talk about turtle sex and like stuff like that, kids will pay attention. This is like, they're really, it's how do you not trick people, but entice people into understanding real complex things about the world. You provide them with good education and good opportunity, and that's all we can do.
Yeah, accidental learning, where it's like, in the case of this, come for the turtle stacks, stay for the science lesson. You know what I mean? Like that, whatever gets these kids excited. But like that's true, whatever. Like we're going to talk about something crazy and wild, but it's also can it be applicable for their own bodies? Because I think that's a
Yeah.
huge problem too. Is body positivity. I mean, that's
Yeah.
something that I think is
Oof.
really important.
I mean, that's here. I mean, we don't have time to go into, but that whole
Yeah,
thing. Let me just one thing that I talk about in the book. There's this weird thing in some contemporary societies, our society, for example, about hair. Right, hair distribution across human bodies is highly variable, and the actual definition of hirsutism, right, too much hair, is more hair than is typical for a woman in this body. And I'm like, what does that even mean? That's not the way it works. Across the human species, there's huge variation in hair covering, in location of hair stuff, and what's going on. So if you're going to make a definition of a problem by there's just more hair than I would like on this woman, that's not biology. It's not science. And also by not understanding what typical variation looks like across our species, people feel bad about themselves because they don't fit some socially constructed idea of what it means to be a man or a woman. And that's messed up. So biology actually comes to the rescue there and is like, dude, check it out. Here we go.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking to a woman who's had laser hair removal on pretty much every inch of her body that's not her head. I'm not my eyebrows. I'm not even kidding. And Augustine, this is a fun story. Had it done, I don't even know, 6, 7 times on my legs. Still get tons of hair, and it's hilarious because they like realize I have multiple follicles. I'm that hairy. The point being, I thought there was something desperately wrong. I started shaving my legs in like 5th grade. Again, I wish I had read your book. I wish there was an acceptance that bodies are different. Bodies have variation, and that is okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much. Where can folks find you? Don't go
Folks
to
can
his
find me
house.
on Blue Sky. Yeah, right. No. You can read my stuff. You can find me on Blue Sky, right? Anthro Fuentes, both on Blue Sky and still on Twitter. But I don't know why I'm still there. I mean, and I don't pay attention. I'm actually on Facebook and Instagram, but I don't really use them. But I will look every now and then. But most importantly, I'm giving talks on the East Coast and West Coast over the next few months. Look on my Blue Sky or Twitter feeds, and I'll announce where they're happening. I publish stuff. There's a nice piece coming out in the magazine Natural History next week, probably. I'll have something out in New Scientist before too long, and a few other just essays around the same topic. And again, and I want to acknowledge Dalton Puckett here, who's making some comments on the side. Look, this is really important to discuss. I can't answer the questions right now because we don't have time. I got to go, but this is the way to sort of get conversations going. People have to not be afraid to ask questions when they don't know. They have to be not afraid to say, hey, this is what I think, this is what I believe. How come these things don't fit together? How do we figure it out? The more we talk about this stuff with actual data and information and knowledge, the better we're going to be in our heads, in our lives, and with each other. And right now, we really need to be good with one another. We need some compassion, some empathy, and some just caring to spread around, because it's just in too short supply at the moment.
Oh, Augustine, you're the best, honestly. And your book reflects that. There's a lot of compassion in your book. There's not an ounce of you should know this. You come at it from a place of, I'm here to help. I'm here to educate. So thank you so much for everything you do, debunking all these myths. I need to have you back on to talk about all the other books you've
Totally.
written.
Anytime.
And seriously, folks, buy all his books, all of them. Read them all. Go to the library if you don't have the money, but just make sure you digest what Augustine has to say. Thank you so much for being here. I know you have to run, so at any point, if you need to jump off, you're more than welcome to.
I got to run. I have to go pick someone up at the train station. But thank you for having me. As always, so much fun, Natalia.
So
you
much
rock.
fun.
You are excellent.
You're the best. Have a good day. And to folks at home, thank you so much for watching. Please, honestly, like I said, if you don't have the money, get it from the library. But if you have the money, get his book. It comes out May 6th. Sex is a Spectrum, The Biological Limits of the Binary. It really is a very well written, compassionate book that really breaks down everything you need to know. So you can come with the facts if somebody tries to talk to you, say an uncle that might be transphobic. You have, in your back pocket, the facts that you might need and the fun stories about turtle sex. You want that. Okay, so folks, thanks so much. Please like, subscribe, and if you had a good time, please consider joining my Patreon. It would be very appreciated. It helps me make all my Scicomm content, including the show, which I love doing. This has been so much fun. And the baddest thank you to, I always call him Dr. Peter de Tucker, my producer in the Netherlands. We lekker that. And I want to thank my Patreons right now, my patrons. Hold on one second. And next week, by the way, it's going to be a surprise guest because I'll be on the road. So tune back in shortly for that. Okay, patrons, I would like to thank Daniel Wynn, Claude Allen, Tom Skullbeard, Tori Yates, or Redding Maley. I'm going to see him this weekend. Dana Logan, Michael Z. Weinstock, David Leitner, James Hudspeth, Anthony Zana, Tom Berman, Jen Beverstock, Scott Froschauer, JSB, Jeff Cohen, Andrea Bloom, and Dr. Jonathan Marks, who's retiring soon, and Kelly Frazier. Also, Michael Clanton, thank you so much for joining this week. That meant so much to me. And everybody, until next week, stay extra, extra filthy.